Hey folks, this is Caleb, just making a YouTube, Facebook video. Just had to give my personal opinion comment on that speech we just heard from Donald Trump about Cuba. Now, let's comment on the location and that crowd. He was in a crowd of anti-Castro Cubans living in Miami. It's important to note that there are a lot of terrorist groups operating out of Miami that are working against the Cuban government. Operating right now in Florida, we have Luis Posada Carriles. This is an individual who blew up an airline in Cuba, killed innocent children. This guy's a terrorist, and he's being harbored by the United States, and he's living in Florida. Furthermore, you know, there have been Miami Cubans who have blown up hotels in Cuba. They've tried to poison food. I want to know how many people in that crowd Donald Trump was standing with when he gave that anti-Cuban speech were terrorists. How many of them were terrorists that have killed innocent civilians in Cuba? Now, furthermore, there were a couple things in the speech that were interesting to note. Like one thing he said towards the beginning of the speech, he said, "Communism has destroyed every nation where it's ever been tried." Really? What was China like in 1949? And what is China like today? If you look at the way Russia and the surrounding countries were in 1917 and compare it to the way they were in 1935, or the way that they were after they defeated the Nazis in the 1950s, or after they were the first country to launch a satellite into orbit with Sputnik, or after they had Yuri Gagarin, the first person to go into outer space, you just don't see the failure of a nation. And when Trump goes on about the plight of the Cuban people, like he hates seeing the Cuban people so oppressed by this evil regime, why don't we compare the living conditions of Cubans to the living conditions of people in Mexico, right? Mexico has a totally free market, pro-US regime. They've privatized things, neoliberalism, NAFTA. The drug cartels are running rampant and killing people. People are hungry. People are homeless. People are piling onto the U.S. border trying to get out. Look at Honduras. This is a country that had a socialist president, Manuel Zelaya, and he was toppled in a U.S.-backed coup. Now they have a pro-U.S. regime. People in Honduras are miserable. They've got a high murder rate. They've got hunger. They've got misery. Look at Guatemala. Look at all the countries throughout Latin America that have free market neoliberal policies, and compare the living conditions in those countries with the living conditions in Cuba. Or talk about other Caribbean islands. Compare the way Cubans live to the way people live in Haiti, another US-backed regime. It's pretty obvious to see that Trump's words were, shall we say, a little bit disingenuous. Now, furthermore, one thing that I thought was probably the most ironic thing about the speech is while Trump was beating his chest and giving all this anti-communist, talking point and getting applauded by this crowd of people who may or may not have included terrorists, it was interesting to note that he subtly admits he's not closing the U.S. embassy in Cuba, so diplomatic relations are staying intact. He's not enacting a new travel ban, and he's allowing U.S. companies to continue investing in Cuba. So even though he gave this fiery anti-communist speech and talked against the Cuban government, he's actually keeping Obama's policies, or at least a lot of them, intact. So the whole thing was just theater. This was just propaganda brought to you by the American media, brought to you by the American president, and that's really all it should be. People shouldn't take this speech too seriously.